What happens when a coward's lies meet the truth of a Deathworlder's past? In the far reaches of space, where alien civilizations gather in massive stations, reputation means everything. Some earn their status through courage and skill. Others, they steal it with carefully crafted lies. But what occurs when someone who has actually faced the horrors of a death world, someone who has survived what others only pretend to understand, sits quietly in the shadows, listening to elaborate tales of fictional heroism? Commander Zephyr Kane thought she was just stopping for supplies and a quiet drink. She never expected to become the center of a story that would shake the very foundations of how the galaxy views humanity. Sometimes the most dangerous predator in the room is the one nobody notices, the one who lets others talk while she simply listens. This is the story of what happens when boasts meet reality, when lies collide with lived experience, and when a human shows an entire space station why Earth is called a death world for very good reasons. Buckle up. The truth is about to come out, and it's far more terrifying than any fiction. The Nexus station hummed with the constant thrum of 1,000 different species going about their business. In the depths of its commercial district, nestled between a Corvan spice merchant and a Thelian tech shop, sat the Gravitational Pull, a bar that catered to the rougher elements of galactic society. The lighting was deliberately dim, the air thick with various atmospheric mixes that different species required, and the conversations hushed enough that secrets could be shared without fear of unwanted listeners. Commander Zephyr Kane pushed through the heavy blast doors and paused just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the murky interior. She had been traveling for 3 standard months, jumping from one outer rim system to another, trying to stay ahead of the nightmares that followed her from the Kepler incident. The Gravitational Pull looked like exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear into a corner booth and drink in peace. She was wrong. Zephyr had barely taken 2 steps toward the bar when a booming voice cut through the ambient noise like a plasma cutter through hull plating. The source was a massive Carillion warrior named Thax, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with the characteristic blue-gray hide and prominent cranial ridges that marked his species as one of the galaxy's premier military forces. He was gesturing wildly with all 4 of his arms, holding court before a semicircle of fascinated listeners from at least 6 different species. And then, Thax was saying, his voice carrying easily across the bar, "The human charged straight at me. Can you believe it? This tiny, soft-skinned creature from one of those notorious death worlds thought it could take on a trained Carillion shock trooper." Several of the listeners made appreciative noises. A small, insectoid chitric clicked its mandibles in what Zephyr recognized as amusement. 2 vegan traders, pale, elongated humanoids with large, dark eyes, leaned forward with obvious interest. Even the bartender, a surly Thelian with tentacles instead of arms, had stopped cleaning glasses to listen. Zephyr found herself an empty stool at the far end of the bar, well outside the circle of Thax's audience, but close enough to hear every word. She ordered a double shot of Terran whiskey, one of the few human luxuries that had made it this far into the outer rim, and settled in to listen despite herself. "You have to understand," Thax continued, warming to his subject. "Deathworlders might have a reputation for being dangerous, but that's just propaganda. Fear-mongering. I've dealt with humans before, and let me tell you, they're not nearly as tough as they pretend to be." This one was wearing full combat armor, carrying enough weapons to outfit a small army, and it still couldn't handle one real warrior. The Chitric's compound eyes glittered with curiosity. "What happened next, Thax? How did you defeat this Deathworlder?" Thax's chest swelled with pride, his 4 arms spreading wide as if to encompass the enormity of his accomplishment. It was almost too easy, to be honest. The human tried some of those fancy martial arts moves they're supposedly famous for, all flash and no substance, if you ask me. I grabbed it by the throat, lifted it clean off the ground, and squeezed until it stopped moving. The whole fight lasted maybe 30 seconds. Zephyr took a slow sip of her whiskey and said nothing, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind her gray eyes. One of the vegan traders spoke up, his voice high and reedy. "But, Thax, the reports say that humans are incredibly resilient, that they can survive injuries that would kill most other species, that they have this thing called adrenaline that makes them stronger and faster in combat situations." Thax waved a dismissive hand. "Propaganda. Pure propaganda designed to make their enemies hesitate in battle. I've seen what humans are really like when they're cornered, and, trust me, they break just like everyone else. Maybe easier, since they're so small and fragile." The bartender finally spoke, his translated voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Thax, I've heard stories about humans that would make your scales turn white. They say humans will fight even when they're dying, that they'll sacrifice themselves to protect others without a second thought. They call it going down swinging, I think. Stories," Thax scoffed. "War stories, and tall tales designed to build their reputation. The truth is, I've personally killed 3 humans in single combat, and none of them put up much of a fight. The first one actually tried to surrender before I even touched it, begged for its life in that pathetic way humans do when they realize they're outmatched." Zephyr's hand tightened imperceptibly around her glass. The whiskey burned as it went down, but not nearly as much as the lies burning in her ears. The Chitric leaned forward eagerly. "Tell us about the other 2. How did those fights go?" Thax settled into his story with obvious relish. The second human was supposedly some kind of elite soldier. Special forces, they called it. It was part of a team that was trying to establish a forward operating base on Kepler 442b. You know, that contested world in the outer territories where the mining rights are still being fought over. Zephyr's entire body went rigid. Kepler 442b. The name hit her like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories she had spent months trying to suppress. The red dust, the screaming, the sound of Marcus calling her name as the building collapsed. The weight of responsibility that had nearly crushed her soul. "I was part of the force sent to remove them," Thax continued, oblivious to the sudden tension that had gripped the human woman at the far end of the bar. "Command thought it would be a difficult operation. Humans are supposed to be good at defensive warfare, after all. But, when we actually engaged them, they folded like paper. This elite soldier I mentioned, I caught it trying to hide behind some supply crates. It was shaking so hard it could barely hold its weapon." The vegan trader who had spoken earlier looked confused. "But, Facts. Didn't that operation end badly for the Carillion forces? I remember reading reports about heavy casualties, something about the human defenders making a last stand that decimated your assault teams. Fax's expression darkened for just a moment before he forced his features back into a confident smile. More propaganda and exaggeration. Yes, we took some losses, that's what happens in war. But the humans were eliminated, and we achieved our objectives. The reports about their heroic last stand were just the military trying to save face after losing their forward base. Zephyr drained the rest of her whiskey in one burning gulp and signaled the bartender for another. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, but anyone who looked closely might have noticed the way her jaw clenched or the sudden stillness that had come over her entire body. The third human was the most pathetic of all, Fax was saying now, his voice full of disdain. It was the commander of that same unit, supposedly this legendary warrior who had survived dozens of battles. When I finally cornered it in the ruins of their command post, do you know what it did? It tried to negotiate. Offered me information about human military tactics in exchange for its life. The assembled listeners made various sounds of disgust and disbelief. The concept of a warrior trying to bargain for survival was apparently as distasteful to them as it was to Fax. Of course, I didn't accept, Fax continued proudly. A warrior's honor means something, even if humans don't understand that concept. I ended its miserable life quickly, more mercy than it deserved, really. The ironic thing is, after we eliminated their commander, the rest of their force completely fell apart. They had been depending on this one individual to hold them together, and without their leader, they were nothing. Zephyr's second glass of whiskey arrived, and she wrapped her fingers around it without drinking. The bartender's tentacles moved nervously as he sensed the sudden change in the human's demeanor, but Fax was too caught up in his story to notice. That's the real truth about Deathworlders, Fax declared, spreading his arms wide again. They're not the terrifying warriors the propaganda makes them out to be. They're just another species trying to survive in a hostile galaxy, and when push comes to shove, they break just like everyone else. The whole Deathworld reputation is just clever marketing designed to make other species think twice before challenging them. One of the other patrons, a scaled reptarian mercenary who had been listening quietly until now, finally spoke up. Fax, are you absolutely certain about these stories? Because I've worked with human mercenaries before, and they had a reputation for never backing down from a fight, no matter how hopeless the odds. Fax's four eyes fixed on the reptarian with barely concealed irritation. Are you questioning my word, Scales? I was there. I fought them. I killed them. What more proof do you need than the testimony of someone who has actually faced these so-called deadly humans in combat? The reptarian raised his hands in a placating gesture. No offense intended, Fax. I'm just saying that my experiences were different. The humans I worked with seemed, well, they seemed like exactly the kind of warriors who would make their homeworld notorious throughout the galaxy. Then, you worked with different humans, Fax replied firmly. Or maybe you fell for their psychological warfare tactics. They're good at making themselves seem more dangerous than they actually are. But, I've seen through their facade, and I'm telling you the truth. Humans are no more dangerous than any other species, and considerably less dangerous than most. Zephyr finally lifted her second glass of whiskey to her lips and took a small sip, savoring the burn. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried clearly through the bar despite the ambient noise. Interesting story, Carillion. I have just one question. Fax turned toward the voice, his four eyes scanning the bar until they found the small human woman sitting alone at the far end. She was unremarkable at first glance, average height for her species, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing civilian clothes that were practical rather than fashionable. The only thing that stood out was her eyes, which were the color of storm clouds, and seemed to hold depths that didn't match her quiet demeanor. A question? Fax asked, his voice taking on an amused tone. Let me guess, you're human yourself, and you want to defend the reputation of your species? Zephyr shook her head slowly. No, nothing like that. I'm just curious about one detail of your story. She took another sip of whiskey, her eyes never leaving Fax's face. You said you killed 3 humans in single combat on Kepler, 442b, including their commander. That's right, Fax confirmed, puffing out his chest with pride. 3 Deathworlders who discovered that their reputation was greatly exaggerated. Zephyr nodded thoughtfully. And, you said this happened during the fighting for the forward operating base on Kepler, 442b, when Carillion forces were sent to remove the human presence. Exactly. I was part of the assault force that eliminated the human defenders. I see. Zephyr set down her glass with a soft click that somehow seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet bar. That's fascinating, because I was the commander of that human unit on Kepler, 442b. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds were the ambient hum of the station's life support systems, and the barely audible whisper of recycled air moving through the ventilation ducts. Every eye in the bar was now fixed on the small human woman who had just delivered what should have been an impossible statement. Fax stared at her for a long moment, his forearms suddenly, very still. You're lying, he said finally, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. Zephyr stood slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. As she turned to face Fax fully, the assembled patrons could see something that hadn't been visible while she was sitting at the bar, a complex web of scar tissue that covered the left side of her neck and disappeared beneath her collar, the kind of scarring that came from surviving an explosion at close range. Marcus Chun was my demolitions expert, she said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. He had a habit of humming old Earth songs while he worked with explosives. Sarah Kim was my sniper. She could put a round through a coin at 800 meters. David Park was our medic, and he used to joke that his job was keeping the rest of us alive long enough to do something spectacularly stupid. Fax's hide had begun to pale, taking on an unhealthy grayish tint. James Rodriguez was my communications specialist, Zephyr continued, her voice still calm and steady. He had pictures of his daughter back on Luna Station that he would show to anyone who would look. Ahmed Hassan was our heavy weapons expert, and he was convinced that there was no problem in the universe that couldn't be solved with the right application of high explosives. She took a step closer to Fax, and Despite the fact that she barely came up to his chest, the massive Carillion warrior actually took a step backward. 27 brave men and women under my command died on Kepler 442b, Zephyr said, and for the first time, her voice carried a hint of steel. They died fighting a force that outnumbered them 12 to 1, holding a position that was strategically indefensible because they believed in their mission and they trusted me to lead them. Another step forward, another step back from Thax. We held that forward operating base for 6 days against constant assault. 6 days of nonstop fighting, with no resupply, no reinforcement, and no hope of rescue. By the end, we were down to our last ammunition clips and our last ration packs. But we never surrendered, and we never retreated. The bar was so quiet now that Zephyr's footsteps seemed to echo like gunshots as she approached the increasingly nervous Carillion. On the 6th day, when your forces finally overran our positions, do you know what we did? She asked, stopping just within arm's reach of Thax. We rigged every building in the base with explosives. When your victorious assault force moved in to claim their prize, we brought the whole thing down on their heads. Thax's breathing had become rapid and shallow. You died in that explosion. You couldn't have survived. Zephyr smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I was thrown clear by the blast, buried under rubble for 18 hours with a punctured lung, 3 broken ribs, and burns over 30% of my body. But humans are funny that way, Carillion. We're remarkably hard to kill. She reached up and touched the scar tissue on her neck. This is what surviving a death world looks like. These are the marks of someone who has actually fought and bled and watched good people die for something they believed in. Thax was now pressed against the wall behind him, his forearms spread wide as if he could somehow disappear into the metal plating. So I have to ask, Zephyr said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. If you killed me on Kepler 442b like you claimed, then why am I still breathing? The silence stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Thax's pale blue hide had now taken on an almost white pallor, and his 4 eyes darted frantically around the bar as if looking for an escape route. The assembled audience remained frozen, caught between fascination and terror as they watched the confrontation unfold. Zephyr waited patiently for an answer that never came. When it became clear that Thax had no response to offer, she nodded once and turned back toward the bar. Bartender, another whiskey, please. Make it a double. The Thelian's tentacles moved with jerky, nervous motions as he prepared the drink, clearly disturbed by what he had just witnessed. The other patrons remained motionless, as if afraid that any sudden movement might draw the humans' attention to them. Zephyr had barely taken a sip of her fresh drink when Thax found his voice again. It was higher pitched than before, with a tremor that betrayed his fear, but he was clearly desperate to salvage what remained of his reputation. You're lying, he declared, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. I was there. I fought in that battle, and I know what happened. You're just some human trying to claim credit for something you had nothing to do with. Zephyr slowly turned back to face him, her expression unchanged. Am I? Yes. Thax's voice was gaining strength as he convinced himself that he could still control the narrative. You probably heard stories about Kepler 442b and decided to pretend you were there. Humans are good at deception, I'll give you that much. But I know the truth, and the truth is that every human defender on that base died, including their cowardly commander. The Reptarian mercenary who had questioned Thax's story earlier spoke up quietly. Actually, Thax, I think you might be the one who's lying. Every eye in the bar swiveled toward the scaled warrior. Thax's 4 arms began to tremble with rage. How dare you question my honor? I am a Carillion shock trooper. My word is my bond. The Reptarian remained calm in the face of Thax's fury. I never questioned your honor, friend. I questioned your truthfulness. There's a difference. He gestured toward Zephyr with one clawed hand. You see, I happen to know who this human is. A murmur of interest rippled through the assembled crowd. Zephyr raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting to see where this unexpected development would lead. Her name is Commander Zephyr Kane, the Reptarian continued, also known as Ghost 6 to her unit, and the Devil of Kepler to anyone who fought against her. She's something of a legend in mercenary circles, though she's been keeping a low profile for the past few months. Thax's expression shifted from anger to confusion to growing alarm. That's impossible. The Devil of Kepler is just a myth, a story humans tell to make themselves seem more dangerous than they really are. The Reptarian shook his head. No myth, I'm afraid. I've never met her personally until tonight, but I've worked with people who served under her command. They spoke of her with the kind of respect that can't be faked. His scaled features took on a grim cast. They also told me about Kepler 442b, about how a single human unit held off an entire Carillion battle group for 6 days, and how their final act of defiance killed more enemy soldiers than the previous 5 days of fighting combined. One of the vegan traders spoke up, his reedy voice cutting through the tension. I remember reading about that battle in the military intelligence briefings. The casualty reports were significant. Nearly 300 Carillion casualties from a force that was supposed to number less than 30 humans. Thax's hide had now gone completely white. You're all lying. You're all in on this deception. There's no way one human unit could inflict that kind of damage on a superior Carillion force. Zephyr finally spoke again, her voice still calm and conversational. You want proof, Carillion? Very well. She reached into her jacket and withdrew a small, metallic device that looked like a standard personal data pad. Computer, access personnel file, Commander Zephyr Kane, Terran Colonial Marines, service number TC, 7749, Delta. A holographic display materialized above the device, showing a 3-dimensional image of official military documentation. The text was in multiple languages, including Carillion script, and bore the seal of the Terran Colonial Authority. Personnel record, Commander Zephyr Kane, a synthesized voice announced. Current status, active duty. Rank, Commander, Terran Colonial Marines. Unit assignment, Task Force Echo, Special Operations Division. Notable operations, Defense of Kepler, 442b Forward Operating Base, Operation Broken Arrow on Titan Station, Liberation of the Proxima Mining Colony, Counterinsurgency Operations in the Vega System. The holographic display shifted to show a list of commendations and medals, followed by a detailed after-action report from Kepler 442b. The document was extensive, running to dozens of pages of text, tactical diagrams, and casualty reports. Battle summary. Kepler 442b engagement. The voice continued. Terran Force, 28 personnel under command of Commander Zephyr Kane. Carillion Force, estimated battalion strength, approximately 340 personnel. Duration, 6 standard days. Outcome. Tactical victory for Carillion forces, strategic and psychological victory for Terran forces due to disproportionate casualty exchange ratio. Thax stared at the holographic display in horror as it continued to scroll through page after page of documentation that contradicted everything he had claimed. The other patrons leaned forward to get a better look, their expressions ranging from fascination to awe. Final casualty count. The synthesized voice announced with clinical precision. Terran forces, 27 killed in action, 1 wounded and evacuated. Carillion forces, 283 killed in action, 47 wounded, status of remaining personnel unknown. The hologram flickered and dissolved, leaving the bar in stunned silence. Zephyr calmly tucked the data pad back into her jacket and took another sip of her whiskey. Thax's breathing was now rapid and shallow, his 4 eyes fixed on the human woman who had just systematically demolished his fabricated heroics. How did you survive? He whispered. Luck, mostly, Zephyr replied with a shrug. The explosion that brought down the command post threw me clear of the main collapse zone. I was unconscious and buried under debris for about 18 hours before a Terran search and rescue team found me. Spent the next 3 months in a military hospital having my lung reinflated and my bones put back together. She touched the scars on her neck again. These are from shrapnel that barely missed my carotid artery, half an inch to the left, and I would have bled out in seconds. But humans are stubborn that way. We tend to survive things that should kill us. The Chitrix compound eyes glittered with newfound respect. Commander Kane, if I may ask, what was it like, facing such overwhelming odds with no hope of victory? Zephyr considered the question for a moment before answering. Terrifying, she said simply. Anyone who tells you they weren't afraid in a situation like that is either lying or a sociopath. Fear is what keeps you alive in combat. It makes you careful, makes you think before you act, makes you aware of threats you might otherwise miss. She paused to take another drink. But fear isn't the same thing as cowardice. Being afraid doesn't mean you run away or give up. It just means you understand the stakes involved. The vegan trader who had spoken earlier leaned forward with obvious curiosity. But how did such a small force hold out for so long against such superior numbers? The tactics involved must have been incredibly sophisticated. Actually, they were surprisingly simple, Zephyr replied. We had 3 main advantages working for us: superior defensive positions, better individual training, and the fact that we were fighting for something we believed in while the Carillions were just following orders. Thax made a sound that might have been a protest, but Zephyr continued as if he hadn't spoken. The base was built into a series of natural rock formations that provided excellent cover and clear fields of fire. We had spent weeks preparing those positions, laying mines, setting up crossfire zones, and establishing fallback positions that would channel any attacking force into predetermined kill zones. She gestured with her glass, using it to illustrate tactical movements. More importantly, every member of my unit was a veteran with real combat experience. We weren't fresh recruits or garrison troops. We were specialists who had been selected specifically for deep reconnaissance and defense missions in hostile territory. The Reptarian nodded approvingly. Professional soldiers rather than conscripts. That would make a significant difference in combat effectiveness. Exactly, Zephyr confirmed. But the most important factor was psychological. We knew that if we failed to hold that base, the entire Outer Rim mining operation would be in jeopardy. Thousands of civilian workers and their families were depending on us to keep the shipping lanes secure. That's not the kind of responsibility you take lightly. She looked directly at Thax, who was still pressed against the wall with a look of growing panic on his blue-gray features. That's what you don't understand about humans, Carillion. We don't fight because we're not afraid of dying. We fight because there are things more important than our own lives. The bar had filled up while they were talking, and Zephyr now noticed that a substantial crowd had gathered to listen to the conversation. Word had apparently spread throughout this section of the station that something interesting was happening at the gravitational pull, and beings of a dozen different species had come to see what the fuss was about. Among the newcomers was a group of Carillion civilians who had positioned themselves near the back of the crowd. They were wearing the simple robes of merchants or traders rather than military uniforms, but their body language suggested they were deeply disturbed by what they were hearing. One of them, a female with the lighter coloring that marked her as relatively young by Carillion standards, finally worked up the courage to speak. Commander Kane, if I may ask, were you the only survivor from your unit? Zephyr's expression grew somber. The only one, yes. 27 good people died under my command because I led them into an impossible situation and couldn't find a way to get them out alive. That's not your fault, the young Carillion said quickly. From what we've heard, they chose to stay and fight. They could have retreated or surrendered. Could they? Zephyr asked quietly. We all knew what happens to prisoners in that part of the galaxy. The Carillion military doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to treating captured enemies humanely. An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. It was common knowledge throughout the Outer Rim that Carillion forces had a tendency to execute prisoners rather than deal with the logistical complications of housing and feeding them. The young Carillion's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again. Is that why they chose to fight to the end? Because they knew they would be killed anyway? Partly, Zephyr admitted. But mostly they fought because it was the right thing to do. Because innocent people were counting on them. And because they were soldiers who understood what that meant. Thax finally found his voice again, though it was still shaky with fear. You said you rigged the base with explosives. You murdered those soldiers in cold blood. Every eye in the bar turned toward him with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility. Even his fellow Carillions seemed disturbed by his accusation. Zephyr's voice remained calm, but there was ice in her gray eyes. I gave those soldiers every opportunity to leave the base intact. I broadcast warnings on all military frequencies for over an hour, telling your forces that the installation had been rigged with demolition charges and would be destroyed if they attempted to occupy it. She set down her glass with deliberate precision. Your commanding officers chose to ignore those warnings. They sent their troops in anyway, apparently believing that humans don't follow through on their threats. The Reptarian mercenary shook his head slowly. That was a tactical error of the highest magnitude. In my experience, humans always follow through on their threats, especially when they have nothing left to lose. We had already lost everything that mattered, Zephyr confirmed. Our friends were dead, our mission had failed, and we were about to be overrun by superior numbers. At that point, denying the enemy the use of our installations was the only meaningful action we had left. She looked around the assembled crowd, making eye contact with as many individuals as possible. That's what it means to be from a death world. It's not that we're immune to fear or that we enjoy violence. It's that we understand that some things are worth dying for, and we're willing to pay that price when necessary. One of the newer arrivals, a tall, insectoid Manthari trader, clicked its mandibles in what might have been approval. This explains much about human behavior that has puzzled our species. We have observed that humans will often choose conflict over negotiation, even when the odds of success are minimal. Not exactly, Zephyr corrected. Humans prefer negotiation when it's possible. But we've learned from our history that there are times when negotiation isn't an option, when the other party has no intention of honoring any agreement they might make. She glanced at Thax, who had somehow managed to make himself even smaller despite his massive size. When you're dealing with someone who sees compromise as weakness and mercy as an opportunity for exploitation, sometimes the only language they understand is violence. The Manthari's head tilted in a gesture that suggested deep thought. Are you saying that humans resort to violence because they believe it to be more honest than negotiation? I'm saying that humans resort to violence when we believe it's the only way to protect something we care about, Zephyr replied. We've learned that predators respect strength more than words, and that the best way to avoid a fight is to make it clear that you're prepared to win one. A new voice spoke from the back of the crowd, a gravelly bass that belonged to a Thelian security officer who had apparently been summoned by reports of the disturbance. Commander Kane, I'm Officer Zerth with Station Security. We've received reports of a possible altercation involving threats of violence. Zephyr turned to face the security officer, her hands visible and well away from her body in a gesture of non-aggression. No threats have been made, officer. We've simply been having a discussion about military history and the nature of courage. Officer Zerth's tentacles writhed as he scanned the crowd, clearly picking up on the tension that filled the bar. I see. And would this discussion happen to involve the individual who has been telling stories about his supposed combat victories? Every eye in the room turned toward Thax, who was now sweating profusely and seemed to be having difficulty breathing. The massive Carillion warrior who had been so confident just an hour earlier now looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear through the deck plating. That would be me, officer, Thax said in a voice barely above a whisper. But, there seems to have been some misunderstanding about the details of my service record. Officer Zerth's translated voice carried a note of dry amusement. A misunderstanding. I see. And would this misunderstanding involve fabricating military accomplishments that could be easily verified through public records? Thax's hide had now gone from white to a sickly greenish color. I may have embellished certain details for dramatic effect. The stories weren't meant to be taken as literal historical accounts. Of course not. The security officer replied with what was clearly the Thelian equivalent of sarcasm. I'm sure everyone here understood that your claims about single-handedly defeating multiple human commandos were simply artistic interpretation rather than outright lies designed to enhance your reputation. A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, though it was not a friendly sound. Beings throughout the galaxy might belong to different species with vastly different cultures, but they all understood the concept of a braggart being exposed as a fraud. Zephyr finished her whiskey and stood up from her stool. Officer Zerth, I don't wish to press any charges or file any complaints. This has been an educational experience for everyone involved, and I think the lesson has been learned. She walked over to where Thax was cowering against the wall and looked up at him with an expression that was almost sympathetic. A word of advice, Carillion. If you're going to lie about your military service, don't choose battles where the survivors might still be alive to contradict your story. Thax nodded frantically, his forearms pressed tightly against his sides as if he were trying to make himself as small as possible. And another thing, Zephyr continued, her voice dropping to just above a whisper so that only Thax could hear her. The next time you want to boast about killing humans, you might want to make sure there aren't any real Deathworlders in the audience. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a bar full of stunned aliens and one thoroughly humiliated Carillion who would never again claim to have defeated something he had never actually fought. Zephyr had barely made it 3 blocks from the gravitational pull when she heard rapid footsteps behind her. The commercial district of Nexus Station never truly slept, but this section was relatively quiet during the 3rd shift, with most of the shops closed and only a few late-night establishments still operating. The sound of someone hurrying to catch up with her was easy to distinguish from the usual ambient noise. She didn't turn around or slow her pace, but her hand moved instinctively to the concealed plasma pistol beneath her jacket. Years of combat had taught her to be prepared for any situation, especially when leaving behind a crowd of potential enemies who might want revenge for a public humiliation. Commander Kane, please wait. The voice belonged to the young Carillion female who had asked about survivors from Kepler 442b. Zephyr stopped and turned, keeping her hand near her weapon but not drawing it. The Carillion was alone, which reduced the likelihood that this was some kind of trap, but it didn't eliminate the possibility entirely. What do you want? Zephyr asked, her voice neutral but wary. The young Carillion approached slowly, her forearms spread wide in a gesture of peaceful intent. My name is Thyra, she said, slightly out of breath from running to catch up. I wanted to apologize for what happened back there, and to thank you for not making an incident out of it. Zephyr studied the younger being's face, looking for signs of deception or hostility. Thyra appeared genuinely distressed, her pale blue features marked with what humans would recognize as embarrassment and shame. You don't need to apologize for someone else's lies, Zephyr replied. Thax made his own choices, and he has to live with the consequences. But he was representing my people, Thyra protested. In that bar, surrounded by aliens, he was the face of Carillion honor and military tradition. His lies reflected badly on all of us. Zephyr resumed walking, but at a slower pace that allowed Thyra to keep up easily. Your people have a reputation for honor and military prowess that goes back centuries. One coward's boasting isn't going to change that overnight. You're being more generous than we deserve, Thyra said quietly. What Thax did was more than just lying for personal glory. He dishonored the memory of the soldiers who actually fought and died on Kepler, 442b, both human and Carillion. They walked in silence for several minutes, making their way through the maze of corridors that connected the various sections of the massive space station. Zephyr found herself oddly comforted by the young Carillion's presence. After months of traveling alone, dealing with nightmares and guilt that no amount of whiskey seemed able to wash away, it was strangely reassuring to have someone to talk to who seemed to understand the weight of military service. Can I ask you something, Commander? Thyra said eventually. Zephyr. And, yes, you can ask. Earlier, you said that 27 good people died under your command because you led them into an impossible situation. Do you really believe that their deaths were your fault? Zephyr was quiet for a long time before answering. Command responsibility is absolute. When you accept the authority to give orders that can get people killed, you also accept the responsibility for the consequences of those orders. My people died because I chose to hold that base instead of ordering a withdrawal when it became clear that we were outnumbered. But, you said yourself that withdrawal wasn't an option, Thyra pointed out. That there were civilian lives at stake, and that surrendering would likely have meant execution anyway. That doesn't change the fundamental equation, Zephyr replied. I was their commanding officer. It was my job to find a way to complete the mission and bring them home alive. I failed at that job. They had reached a viewing portal that looked out into the vast emptiness of space. Ships of various sizes and configurations moved through the traffic control lanes around the station like a three-dimensional dance of commerce and communication. Zephyr stopped walking and stared out at the stars, her reflection ghost-like in the transparent aluminum window. My grandfather was a Carillion military officer, Thyra said, coming to stand beside her. He fought in the border wars against the hegemony, back when I was just a child. He used to tell me that the mark of a true leader wasn't whether they won or lost, but whether they were willing to share the fate of their troops. Zephyr glanced at the young Carillion. What happened to him? He was killed in action during the siege of Valterra Prime. His ship was destroyed while covering the evacuation of a colony transport. 200,000 civilians made it to safety because he and his crew bought them time to escape. Thyra's voice was soft with old grief. Before he left for that final mission, he told me something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the greatest victory is ensuring that others don't have to make the same sacrifice you're making. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the ships move through their eternal dance around the station. Finally, Zephyr spoke again. Your grandfather sounds like he was a good officer. He was. He would have been ashamed of what Thax did tonight, claiming credit for battles he never fought, and dishonoring the memory of real warriors. Thyra turned to look directly at Zephyr. But he also would have been impressed by your restraint. A lesser person would have responded to those lies with violence. Violence should be a last resort, not a first response, Zephyr replied. I learned that lesson on Kepler, 442b. What do you mean? Zephyr was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. The truth is, we could probably have held that base indefinitely if we had been willing to use more aggressive tactics from the beginning. Human military doctrine includes several strategies for dealing with siege situations that we chose not to employ, such as chemical weapons, biological warfare, targeting civilian population centers to force the enemy to divert resources to protecting non-combatants. Zephyr's voice carried a note of distaste as she listed the options, all perfectly legal under the rules of engagement that applied to that particular conflict zone. Thyra's four eyes widened in understanding. But you chose not to use those tactics because they would have caused unnecessary suffering. My unit was made up of soldiers, not monsters, Zephyr confirmed. We could have turned that entire region into a wasteland and forced the Carillion commanders to choose between accepting massive civilian casualties or withdrawing their forces. Instead, we chose to fight a clean war, even though it meant accepting worse odds for ourselves. That's remarkably noble, given what was at stake. Zephyr shook her head. It's not nobility, it's professionalism. The moment you start targeting innocents or using weapons of mass destruction, you stop being a soldier and start being a terrorist. My people understood that distinction, and they were willing to die rather than cross that line. A new voice interrupted their conversation, a familiar gravelly bass that belonged to Officers Earth. Excuse me, ladies, but I was hoping I might have a word with both of you. They turned to find the Thelian security officer approaching with two companions, a tall, thin vegan in an expensive suit who had the look of a station administrator, and a grizzled-looking human male wearing the insignia of a Terran Colonial Marines colonel. Commander Kane, the human officer said, stepping forward with his hand extended. Colonel Marcus Webb, Terran Colonial Marines. I was hoping I might have a chance to speak with you. Zephyr shook his hand warily. Colonel, what brings a Marine colonel to the Outer Rim? You do, actually, Webb replied with a slight smile. I've been looking for you for the past 3 months. You're a difficult woman to track down when you don't want to be found. I'm on medical leave, Zephyr said carefully. My doctors recommended an extended period of rest and recovery away from military environments. I'm sure they did. Post-traumatic stress is a serious condition, and the Corps takes the mental health of its personnel very seriously. Webb's expression grew more serious. Unfortunately, we have a situation that requires your particular expertise. The vegan administrator cleared his throat politely. Perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting? My office would provide better security for sensitive discussions. Zephyr looked from the colonel to the administrator to Officers Earth, trying to read the situation. What kind of situation requires tracking down an officer who's officially on medical leave? The kind that involves first contact with a previously unknown alien species, Webb replied quietly. A species that has specifically requested to negotiate only with the human who survived Kepler, 442b. The words hit Zephyr like a physical blow. She felt her knees go weak and had to put a hand against the viewing portal to steady herself. That's impossible. How could an unknown species have heard about Kepler 442b? That's one of many questions we need answers to, the colonel said. But the fact remains that 3 days ago, a ship of unknown configuration entered Terran space near the Centauri system and transmitted a message specifically asking for you by name and service record. Thyra stepped closer to Zephyr, her forearms moving in what the human recognized as a protective gesture. Is she under some kind of suspicion? Because if so, I can testify to her character based on what I observed tonight. Webb held up a placating hand. No suspicion at all. Commander Kane isn't in any trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. We need her help. Help with what? Zephyr asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. These aliens, they call themselves the Zethari, claim to have been monitoring Carillion and human military communications during the Kepler 442b engagement. They say they were so impressed by the tactical display they witnessed that they want to establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity. Webb paused to let that sink in. But they've made it clear that they will only negotiate with someone who can speak for the warriors who choose death before dishonor. Zephyr closed her eyes and leaned against the transparent aluminum window. They want to meet with me because of what happened to my unit. It appears so, yes. From what we can determine, the Zethari have a warrior culture that places enormous value on the kind of sacrifice your people made. They see the defense of Kepler 442b as proof that humanity possesses the qualities they consider essential in a worthy ally. What if I refuse? Zephyr asked without opening her eyes. Then, we lose what might be our only chance to establish peaceful relations with a species that possesses technology significantly more advanced than our own, Webb replied honestly. The initial scans of their ship suggest that they're at least a century ahead of us in terms of weapons and defensive systems. Officer Zerth spoke for the first time since making the introductions. Commander, if I may offer an observation, from what I witnessed tonight, you carry a great deal of guilt about the deaths of your subordinates. Perhaps this opportunity would allow their sacrifice to serve a greater purpose. Zephyr opened her eyes and looked at the security officer with surprise. Meaning what? Meaning that if their deaths lead to an alliance that prevents future wars, then they will have saved more lives than just those of the civilians they died protecting, Thyra said, understanding dawning in her voice. Their sacrifice would become the foundation for a lasting peace. The vegan administrator nodded approvingly. A most elegant solution to the psychological burden of survivors' guilt. The dead find meaning through the actions of the living. Zephyr was quiet for a long time, staring out at the stars and the ships moving through the darkness. Finally, she pushed away from the window and turned to face Colonel Webb. What exactly are you asking me to do? Travel to the rendezvous point they've specified and participate in formal first contact negotiations, Webb replied. You'd be part of a larger diplomatic team, but they've made it clear that your presence is non-negotiable. And if these negotiations go badly? If this Zethari species turns out to be hostile despite their current peaceful overtures? Webb's expression grew grim. Then, humanity will face its first interstellar war against an enemy with superior technology, which is why we need someone at those negotiations who understands the true cost of warfare and the value of peace. Zephyr looked around at the assembled group. A Marine colonel who needed her expertise, a security officer who understood her burden, an administrator who saw the larger picture, and a young Carillion who had become an unexpected ally. Each of them was waiting for her decision, and she could see in their faces that they all understood the enormous weight of what was being asked. When do we leave? She asked finally. Webb smiled for the first time since the conversation began. There's a fast courier ship waiting at docking bay 7. We can depart as soon as you're ready. I'll need an hour to gather my things and send some messages, Zephyr said. And Colonel, I want Thyra to come with us. The young Carillion's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But why? Because if we're going to negotiate with a warrior culture that values honor and sacrifice, it might help to have a representative from the species that also fought and died on Kepler 442b, Zephyr explained. The Zethari might be more impressed if they see that both sides of that conflict can work together toward a common goal. Webb considered this for a moment, then nodded. Actually, that's an excellent idea. It would demonstrate that humans are capable of moving past old conflicts and building alliances with former enemies. Thyra's forearms moved in what Zephyr was learning to recognize as nervous excitement. Are you certain you want me to be part of something this important? I'm just a civilian trader with no diplomatic experience. You're a Carillion who understands the true meaning of military honor, and who was willing to apologize for the lies of someone she'd never met before tonight, Zephyr replied. Those qualities matter more than formal training when you're dealing with a species that values character over credentials. Officer Zerth's tentacles writhed in what might have been amusement. An interesting development. This evening began with lies about false military glory and is ending with the possibility of genuine diplomatic achievement. The vegan administrator checked a timepiece on his wrist. If you're planning to depart within the hour, I should begin processing the necessary documentation for an interspecies diplomatic mission. Miss Thyra, I'll need your identification codes and travel authorization. Of course, Thyra replied, still looking somewhat dazed by the rapid turn of events. Though I should mention that I'll need to contact my trading partner to explain why I'll be suddenly unavailable for business. We'll handle any financial compensation for lost revenue, Webb assured her. The Terran Colonial Authority takes care of its diplomatic assets. As the group began to disperse to handle their various preparations, Zephyr found herself looking back through the viewing portal at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, an unknown alien species was waiting to meet the human who had survived the most famous last stand in recent galactic history. They wanted to judge whether humanity was worthy of their respect and alliance based on the actions of 28 soldiers who had chosen to die rather than abandon their post. For the first time since she had been pulled from the rubble of Kepler 442b, Zephyr felt a sense of purpose returning to her life. Her people had died believing they were protecting innocent lives, but perhaps their sacrifice could accomplish something even greater. Perhaps their final stand could become the foundation for a peace that would make future wars unnecessary. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was also a chance for redemption. A chance to prove that Marcus and Sarah and David and the The rest of her unit had not died in vain. A chance to show the galaxy what it really meant to be from a death world. The courier ship Rapid Transit was smaller than Zephyr had expected, built for speed rather than comfort. The main passenger compartment held only 8 acceleration couches, and the sparse interior suggested that this vessel was designed for urgent military missions rather than leisurely diplomatic journeys. As she settled into her assigned couch and ran through the pre-flight safety checklist, she found herself wondering what kind of first impression they would make arriving in such an obviously military craft. Colonel Webb occupied the couch next to hers, reviewing diplomatic briefings on a secure tablet. Across the narrow aisle, Thyra was struggling with the human-designed safety harness, her 4 arms making the process more complicated than it would have been for a bipedal species. 3 other members of the diplomatic team filled the remaining couches: Dr. Elena Vasquez, a xenobiologist and first contact specialist, Ambassador Chun, a veteran diplomat with decades of interspecies negotiation experience, and Captain Rodriguez, the ship's commanding officer who would also serve as military advisor during the upcoming negotiations. Departure in 5 minutes, came the announcement from the cockpit. All personnel secure for acceleration. Zephyr helped Thyra adjust her safety restraints, noting that the young Carillion seemed nervous but excited about her first journey aboard a human vessel. Have you ever been involved in diplomatic negotiations before? Nothing like this, Thyra admitted. I've handled some trade disputes and contract negotiations, but never anything involving first contact with an unknown species. She paused, her 4 eyes reflecting uncertainty. I'm still not entirely sure why you wanted me to come along. Because you understand something that most diplomats never learn, Zephyr replied as she checked her own restraints. You know that honor isn't about winning or losing. It's about doing the right thing regardless of the personal cost. The ship's engines hummed to life, and Zephyr felt the familiar weight of acceleration pressing her into the couch padding. Through the small porthole beside her head, she watched Nexus Station fall away as they entered the shipping lanes that would take them to the jump point for their destination system. Ambassador Chen looked up from his briefing materials. Commander Kane, I've been reviewing what little we know about Zethri culture, and I have to say I'm concerned about their apparent focus on military prowess. In my experience, warrior societies can be extremely difficult to negotiate with because they tend to view compromise as weakness. That depends on how they define strength, Zephyr replied. Some warrior cultures respect brute force and aggression, but others place greater value on discipline, sacrifice, and the ability to make difficult choices under pressure. Dr. Vasquez joined the conversation from her position near the front of the compartment. The xenopsychology profiles suggest that the Zethri fall into the latter category. Their initial communication referenced warriors who choose death before dishonor, which implies a value system based on duty and sacrifice rather than simple violence. Colonel Webb nodded approvingly. That's consistent with what we observed during their approach to our space. Their ship could have simply entered Terran territory without warning, but instead they stopped at the edge of our detection grid and requested permission to proceed. That suggests respect for protocol and boundaries. Or it could suggest that they're being cautious because they're evaluating us as potential threats, Captain Rodriguez pointed out from the pilot's position. A species with superior technology might test our responses before revealing their true capabilities. Thyra spoke up from across the aisle. If they were planning aggression, would they really have requested a specific individual by name? It seems more likely that they're genuinely interested in establishing peaceful relations, but want to ensure they're dealing with worthy partners. That's what worries me, Ambassador Chen admitted. This whole negotiation seems to be predicated on their judgment of human character based on a single military engagement. What if they decide that one battle isn't sufficient evidence of our worthiness? Zephyr stared out the porthole at the stars streaming past as the ship accelerated toward the jump point. Then, we'll have to show them that Kepler 442b wasn't an isolated incident, that the qualities my unit demonstrated are representative of humanity as a whole. And if we can't convince them of that, Dr. Vasquez asked quietly, then we hope their evaluation process doesn't involve putting us to the test personally, Zephyr replied with grim humor. The journey to the rendezvous point took 18 standard hours, including 2 jumps through hyperspace, and a final approach through normal space to the coordinates the Zethri had specified. As they emerged from their second jump, Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom with barely concealed awe. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to want to see this. They crowded around the main viewing port, and Zephyr felt her breath catch in her throat. The Zethri ship was unlike anything she had ever seen, a massive crystalline structure that seemed to grow organically rather than having been constructed. It was easily 10 times the size of their courier vessel, with graceful spires and flowing curves that caught and reflected the light of the nearby star in spectacular displays of color. Preliminary scans show no obvious weapon systems, Captain Rodriguez reported, though his tone suggested he found that fact more disturbing than reassuring. But their hull composition is completely unknown to our databases, and they're generating energy readings that are off the scale. Ambassador Chin straightened his diplomatic uniform and checked his appearance in the reflection of the viewing port. Well, there's no backing out now. Captain, please signal our arrival and request permission to dock. Already done, sir. They're responding now. Rodriguez paused to listen to something in his earpiece. They're requesting that Commander Kane, and they're asking for the Carillion who speaks truth. I assume that means you, Thyra. They want us to come aboard their ship? Thyra asked, her voice betraying nervousness. Apparently so. They're extending a docking tube to our main airlock now. Zephyr moved to the weapons locker and began checking her sidearm, a motion that didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the team. Ambassador Chen raised an eyebrow. Commander, do you really think that's wise? Going armed to a first contact meeting could be interpreted as hostile intent. Going unarmed to a first contact meeting could be interpreted as stupidity, Zephyr replied calmly. I'm not planning to start a fight, but I want to be prepared if someone else does. Colonel Webb nodded approvingly. I concur with the commander's assessment. We're dealing with an unknown species with superior technology, and our primary responsibility is the safety of the diplomatic team. Dr. Vasquez was studying readings from her portable xenobiology scanner. The atmospheric composition in their ship appears to be compatible with our requirements, though the oxygen content is slightly higher than Earth normal. We shouldn't need environmental suits. That's convenient, Thyra muttered, almost as if they've been studying our physiology. The docking process took nearly 30 minutes, largely because the Zethary ship's airlock systems were unlike anything in the database of known galactic technologies. When the connection was finally established, Ambassador Chun took point with Zephyr and Thyra flanking him, while the rest of the team remained on the courier ship as backup. The airlock opened to reveal a corridor that defied easy description. The walls appeared to be made of the same crystalline material as the ship's hull, but they seemed to pulse gently with internal light that shifted from blue to green to silver as they watched. The floor was smooth and slightly yielding underfoot, like walking on a living membrane rather than solid deck plating. Their escort was waiting just beyond the airlock, a tall, graceful being that stood nearly 3 meters in height, but was so slender that it appeared almost fragile. Its skin was translucent pale blue, shot through with patterns of silver that seemed to move and shift like living circuitry. Forearms extended from its torso in positions that were similar to Carillion anatomy, but these ended in hands with 6 fingers each. Most striking were its eyes, large, multifaceted organs that resembled jewels more than biological structures. "Welcome aboard the Meditation of Stars," the being said, its voice coming from speakers embedded in the crystalline walls rather than from any visible mouth. "I am Keeper of Memories Zalthane, and I speak for the Zethary in matters of honor and judgment." Ambassador Chun stepped forward with a formal bow. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Keeper Zalthane. I am Ambassador Chun, representing the Terran Colonial Authority in diplomatic matters." The alien's multifaceted eyes turned toward Chun briefly before focusing on Zephyr. "You are the one who survived Kepler, 442b. "I am," Zephyr replied simply. "And you," Zalthane said, turning to Thyra. "You are Carillion, but you travel with humans. This is unusual." Thyra drew herself up to her full height, which was still considerably shorter than the Zethary. "I am Thyra, daughter of Commander Vexthal who died in the border wars. I travel with Commander Kane because I respect what she and her unit accomplished, and because honor recognizes honor regardless of species." Something that might have been approval flickered in Zalthane's crystalline eyes. "Well spoken. Come. The Council of Memories wishes to evaluate your words and your spirit." They followed the Keeper through corridors that seemed to shift and change as they moved, the crystalline walls rearranging themselves to create new passages and chambers. Zephyr found herself wondering if the ship was partially alive, or if the Zethary simply possessed technology so advanced that it appeared organic to less sophisticated observers. The chamber they eventually reached was enormous, with a domed ceiling that displayed what appeared to be a real-time view of the surrounding star field. Arranged in a circle around the center of the room were 7 more Zethary, each slightly different in coloring and build, but all possessing the same ethereal beauty that marked Zalthane. "The Council of Memories," Zalthane announced. "They have observed your species for many cycles, but this is their first direct contact with individual humans." One of the council members stepped forward, its silver markings pulsing with a rhythmic light. "I am Speaker of Depths Veltron. We have watched your war on Kepler, 442b with great interest, human who survived. Your unit's final stand was impressive." "You watched the battle?" Ambassador Chun asked with surprise. "We monitor all military activities in sectors adjacent to our territory." Another council member replied, this one with golden rather than silver markings. "It is necessary for our security to understand the nature of potential neighbors." Zephyr felt a chill run down her spine. "How much did you see?" "Everything," Veltaron replied simply. "We observed the entire 6-day engagement from beginning to end. We witnessed your tactical decisions, your unit's discipline under fire, and their final choice to deny the enemy a victory even at the cost of their own lives." Thyra stepped forward hesitantly. "If you were monitoring the battle, then you know that both human and Carillion forces fought with honor. Both sides suffered significant casualties in pursuit of their respective objectives." "Indeed," said a third council member, this one with deep blue markings that seemed to flow like water beneath its translucent skin. "The Carillion forces showed considerable courage in their assault, particularly given the defensive advantages held by the human position. Many warriors died attempting to fulfill their duty to their superiors." Zephyr felt something twist in her chest at the reminder that the enemy soldiers who had died in the explosion had been following orders, just as her own people had been. The war was about territory and resources. The individual soldiers on both sides were just trying to do their jobs and get home alive. But they did not all get home alive, Zalthane observed. Many chose duty over survival. This is what caught our attention and earned our respect. Ambassador Chun cleared his throat diplomatically. "Keeper Zalthane, we appreciate your interest in that particular engagement, but I hope you understand that it represents only one example of human military capability. Our species has a long history of conflict resolution through negotiation and peaceful cooperation." "We have observed this as well," Veltaron replied. "Your species possesses an unusual combination of traits, the capacity for both extreme violence and remarkable compassion, often exhibited by the same individuals. This dichotomy intrigues us." Dr. Vasquez chose that moment to speak up through the communication link from the courier ship. "Commander Kane, I'm analyzing the energy patterns from the Zethary vessel, and I'm seeing some interesting resonance frequencies. It appears their technology might be partially psionic in nature." Zalthane's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something the humans couldn't hear. "Your scientist is perceptive. We employ what you might call mental interfaces with our technology and with each other. This allows us to share experiences and memories directly, rather than relying solely on verbal communication. Which is why we wish to meet you in person," the council member with golden markings added. "Verbal reports of your actions were insufficient. We needed to observe your thoughts and motivations directly to judge whether your species possesses the qualities we seek in potential allies." Zephyr felt another chill. "You're reading our minds?" "Not reading. Observing the surface patterns that reflect character and intent," Zalthane corrected. We cannot access specific thoughts or memories without permission, but we can sense the deeper currents of personality and motivation that drive behavior. Thyra's forearms moved nervously. And what have you observed about us? The council members exchanged glances, or what passed for glances among beings with multifaceted eyes. Finally, Velteron spoke. We observe that the human who survived carries great pain from the loss of her subordinates, but also great strength drawn from their memory. She understands that leadership means accepting responsibility for consequences, even when those consequences could not have been prevented. The council member with water blue markings focused on Thyra. We observe that the Carillion who speaks truth values honor above personal advantage, and is willing to acknowledge difficult realities even when they reflect poorly on her own species. Ambassador Chen stepped forward eagerly. And, based on these observations, are you willing to enter into formal negotiations for an alliance between our species? The 7 council members moved closer together, and, for several moments the air in the chamber seemed to hum with barely audible energy as they communicated through methods beyond human understanding. When they separated, Zalthane spoke for the group. We are willing to consider an alliance, but first we must conduct a more thorough evaluation of human character. Words and observations are insufficient for a decision of this magnitude. What kind of evaluation? Zephyr asked, though she was beginning to suspect she wouldn't like the answer. A test, Velteron replied simply. We will present you with a scenario that will demonstrate whether humans possess the qualities necessary for membership in our coalition of species. Colonel Webb's voice came through the communication link, tight with concern. What kind of test are we talking about here? The council member with golden markings answered. A test of courage, wisdom, and moral character under extreme pressure. The same qualities your unit demonstrated on Kepler 442b, but applied to a situation where the stakes are considerably higher. Thyra moved closer to Zephyr. And if we refuse to take this test? Then, we will conclude that humanity is not yet ready for the responsibilities that come with advanced interstellar alliances, Zalthane replied. We will withdraw to our own territory and monitor your species' development for another few centuries. Ambassador Chen looked stricken. Centuries? But surely there must be some other way to. There is no other way. Velteron interrupted gently, but firmly. Character cannot be proven through negotiation or documentation. It can only be demonstrated through action under circumstances where failure carries real consequences. Zephyr felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders like the crushing pressure she had felt under the rubble of Kepler 442b. Once again, the fate of others depended on choices she would have to make, and, once again, there were no good options available. But, perhaps that was exactly the point. Perhaps the test had already begun the moment they stepped aboard the Zethri vessel, and everything that happened from this point forward would be carefully observed and evaluated by alien minds that could perceive the deeper currents of human motivation. She looked around at her companions, Ambassador Chun with his diplomatic training and natural caution, Thyra with her unexpected courage and moral clarity, the voices of her team coming through the communication link, and realized that she wasn't facing this decision alone. The same qualities that had made her unit willing to die on Kepler 442b were present here and now, in different forms, but with the same fundamental strength. What exactly does this test involve, she asked. Zalthane's crystalline eyes seemed to glow brighter. Something that will prove whether humans can be trusted with the power to save or damn entire civilizations.